Hi all, I have another amazing positional game to show you of Leela. This is against Ethereal in the TSEC Season 14 Premier Division. Massive hardware. The opening book, this is a very interesting line. Ethereal playing white, so e4. The opening book is the Karakan, and we have actually this two knights variation with bishop g4. So black is volunteering in this opening book line to give up the light square bishop. We have h3, bishop takes, queen takes, knight f6, d3, e6, and here some of you might remember I covered an epic Fischer against Petrosian game which resulted in 4 queens. I can give you a link to that in the pinned comment. But in that game there was the idea of g3 and bishop g2. Here in this opening book given bishop d2 we have bishop b4, and now e5. This is a very committal move, putting this pawn on a dark square. It does weaken that f5 square. We have knight fd7, and this is the end of the book. This has been seen before in over the board games. Queen g4 hitting g7, and the bishop goes back to f8, which seems a little bit weird, but a positional commitment has already been made by white here. It doesn't matter about this backward development move so much because the position's kind of closed. It's not very tactical in nature, and this in general favors neural network chess in my view, which is more about patterns and positional play than tactical strength. Here f4, and we see that this would be a very, very nice blockade square to try and hem in this bishop within its own pawn chain. So statistically there are pawns on dark squares emerging here. This pawn could later be on a dark square, and it will be ideal to somehow keep this bishop a prisoner in its own pawn chain in particular, and maybe play on the queen side, because black is actually poised here for queenside play. And in fact we see c5 being played. Now h4 in an over the board game, Tiken against Aberg, so Tiken's a 2500 player, he actually didn't play h4, he castled queenside, and after g6 queen f3. And even if h4 there's g4 here, if h5 there's g4, pardon me, so hg, the queen's actually protecting h1. The strategic point is g4 might be desirable, and in fact it's played here, and eventually, not because of these moves necessarily, but eventually it was a win for white. It's an interesting stem game to check out in the pinned comments. But here we see h4. This does seem to, again, statistically, pawns are being put on dark squares. So is this bishop going to be a prisoner or not here? In fact, we have h5. It seems a very natural positional move with tempo on the queen to lock down these pawns, which would in turn lock down the bishop to be a prisoner. Queen d1 doesn't look very inspiring. Knight c6, g3, another pawn on a dark square. Queen b6, bit of queenside pressure. a4, knight d4. This is a very nice perk of black's position, this knight on d4. a5, and now the unusual looking queen a6. But it does make a lot of sense. There is pressure on white's position from here. Knight e2, knight f5. Not a lot is going on actually tactically. This does seem like a positional struggle, something which you'd expect the likes of Tigran Petrosian to play with the black side in his heyday. He was almost invincible in many respects in these type of positions, with heavy prophylaxis and positional play, preventing anything from happening of any danger. Now here, after bishop h3, g6, welcoming double pawns, which essentially would lock down these 3 pawns even more. If this is taken, these are locked down, and there's a nice square on g4. So white castles. We have bishop e7, king h2. And now, yeah, not castling. The king doesn't have to castle. In fact, we see a fantastic improvement of one of the knights here, improving the knight with knight b8 to reroute to knight c6, to be in contact with a more strategically important central square. We have d4, another committal move. Look at statistics of how many pawns are now on dark squares, the potential for this bishop to be a prisoner. And in fact, c4, so not tempted with any idea of taking on d4, just keeping the position ultra closed. c4, and this pawn chain clearly on the queen side is now in black's favour for pressing forward. Generally speaking, queen e1, we have knight c6, so not only putting pressure on d4, but supporting maybe later b5, b4, and also of course putting pressure on a5 at the moment. Actually, it seems as though b5 is also technically possible. A takes is not such a major inconvenience. The queen takes and hits b2. Black's doing quite well there. So we have knight c6, and now the better of the bishops in a way. Well, this bishop isn't that good either now, actually, in this pawn chain. It's given up for that knight on f5. G takes f5, so there's a real lockdown on all of these pawns, it seems. We have rook f3, and now b5 here. A takes, queen takes, bishop c3 protecting b2, queen b5, queen d1, king f8. The king is finding it quite safe over here now. Bishop e1. The bishop really hasn't got much to do in this position. a5, knight c3, the queen goes back, knight a4, king g7. The king is just having a good time over here, no big problems at all. Bishop f2, rook hb8, we have rook c3, king h6. Yes, this did unveil an attack on the h5 pawn. Sneaky. So the king comes to h6 as a preference to protect that h pawn. Rook f3, queen a7, king g2. We have rook b4 now. Rook c3, rook ab8. Now there is a potential for this to be a passed pawn if you can imagine this pawn's removed out of the way, and in fact white is tempted for b3 and b takes, which leaves this as a passed pawn. So b3 is played here, so there's a little bit double-edged, but black is building up some significant pressure here, and it looks as though, you know, sometimes rook takes b2 might be on the cards as an exchange sack, maybe in the near future. But there's other ways of playing the position. For example, queen a6 to b5 to hit a4. So white did seem to have a kind of panic here with b3, because fundamentally there's a trump card being created here, this passed pawn. Now queen a6, we have rook f3, king g6. That looks like an interesting high-class waiting move. Oh dear. Rook b1. Yeah, white is... It's just not a very tactical position at all. This is completely like a strategic position. Rook c8. Rook a1. Rook bb8. B takes c4. Okay, a pawn exchange. Finally. Does it unveil a load of tactics or not? D takes c4 is played. Is there a tactical opportunity, for example, with d5? Well, that was passed up on with king h2. d5 actually can lead to a disaster. Ed, queen takes. In fact, rook d8, and the queen has nowhere to go here. Yeah, this looks pretty unpleasant. Something like knight c5 is maybe queen b5, and the queen's still attacked. So this is just totally to be avoided. So we have that king h2 move, rook d8. Now black simply has got a wonderful blockading square. It seems white has, through some sort of panic, real or imagined, probably real, has not only given black on a plate an outside passed pawn, but also in some ways just as painful, a lovely blockading square on d5 for a knight to be perched on, which essentially, whilst blockading this pawn, gives black virtually an extra pawn. It's like having an extra pawn, basically, when this central pawn is blockaded with a magnificent knight blockade, which also shows like superiority over the bishop. Black's having this extra pawn to play with, in a way. Bishop g1, knight b4. So this is getting to be positionally crushing. Strategic crush is a term sometimes used to describe some games. You might see some commentators saying how it's a strategically lost position. We can say this now of the white position. It's actually strategically lost. These means basically it's extremely difficult to play. The pawn structure has elements of lock-in of certain pieces like the bishop on g1. There's an element of heavy blockading knight which just cannot be assailed. It cannot be attacked from any front. Frontally cannot be attacked. It's just perched there in a very powerful central way. We have this other move which doesn't seem to help matters at all, but if black gets in one or two moves, you know, for example, rook b4, queen c6, that sort of stuff, yeah, it seems another concession, because now after bishop takes c5 it's becoming clearer black's positional advantage, the outside passed pawn, the knight versus bishop. No strategic pawn breaks for white. A positional masterclass. Rook b4, rook fa3. This kind of style of play with ultra closed prophylaxis is ideal, not in the all the rounds that you can manage style tournaments, online tournaments, but rather if you're playing a very, very strong player and you want to play as solidly as possible, and you might know that they're great tactically. It's very, very powerful anti-classic engine chess, really. It's just not too much counterplay at all to deal with. Okay, but a5 is under fire, and this is actually now protected, offering white the opportunity to give up two rooks for the queen. White passes up on that with bishop f2, so you might wonder why. Let's have a look. Rook takes a5, the queen gives herself up. Now these two rooks can, with that perched knight on d5, actually white does have a potentially dangerous pawn, so let's investigate a little bit more. Say c6 to try and do something before these rooks just double and do damage against white's king. The rooks can actually make it a priority to handle this pawn, for example like this, and once they do that and that pawn's taken, then black's just got a big advantage. Black can play things like c3, put pressure on the 7th rank, win c2 later. It's just very, very devoid of any tactics. So that opportunity was passed up. Two rooks, in theory, it depends on the situation, they're often better than the queen. a4, bishop e1, rook b8, bishop f2. We have rook b2, pressures mounting, rook g1. As though there might be an idea of g4, king h6, prophylaxis in advance. It looks as though white has a tactical opportunity here for g4, because there's also the possibility of switching a rook and a rook sack. Let's investigate this for a moment. So g4 hg, rook takes, f takes, queen takes. And now there's a big idea of queen g5 check and, for example, rook g3. This looks very, very dangerous. It turns out black can play c3 here, so this knight's not just pretty, it's pretty functional as well, stopping the rook coming across. The white queen by herself here, after say check, and the rook trying to come in, but first if we play a check here and the rook tries to come in, rook takes c2. This doesn't seem enough. The king, it seems, is not in grave danger. It looks scary, this variation, but it seems as though black is okay. The queen eventually comes in here, and it's white's king which is proven more unsafe. This is a forcing sequence now to clear away all dangers. So it seems as though in this position bishop d4 passes up g4 for good reason. It doesn't seem to work out very well. Very interesting stuff to consider though. So in the game here, bishop d4, not g4, rook b4, we have rook c1. Bishop c3 you might think is an interesting idea. Maybe black can take that and play a3. The passed pawn is very significant here and should give black a nice advantage indeed. For example, like this, with rooks coming to the 7th rank, it's a winning advantage. So we have rook c1, queen c6, queen f2, and now to liberate the pawn further, knight c7 to kick away the blockading piece. So although the knight was beautifully placed, it has a more specific objective here to help this passed pawn. Queen e1, the rook drops back, rook a2, a3, rook ca1, knight b5, queen d2, the queen comes in here, hitting the bishop moves back, rook d8 hitting the queen moves, queen f3, queen e3 offering an exchange of queens. On, for example, king h3, c3 is just nice for rook d2. If white's not doing anything, white just gets crushed now. So queen e3, we have queen c6, queen e1, rook a4, c3 is also possible. I mean, c3, if white's playing queen h1, it's not really much to worry about after queen e8. So anyway, rook a4, queen h1, rook d5, queen f3, rook b4. The knight is holding the pawn, so this rook wants to install itself on b2. And here it's just getting to a critical point. White's at breaking point, not able to do anything, and plays a kind of desperate exchange sacrifice. Rook takes a3. It becomes a lesser evil choice to give up material. The point of being really strategically crushed, to give up material to try and do something. Now, as an example, if this exchange sack is not played, say queen g2, c3, the rook is ready to go into that juicy b2 square supported by both of these pawns. And for example, queen c8, queen g8, and there's wonderful tactics here like rook d1 now to unblockade the pawn further in a very tactical manner. So yeah, this is hopeless. The two connected passed pawns are winning here, but also there's, because of queen g8, there's queen g4 check first as well, so it's not even a sacrifice on d1. If takes check, then taking on d1, and these pawns are absolutely crushing. Clearly this is just hopeless. There's nothing going on there for white. So rook takes a3, pretty desperate, but a desperate situation indeed. So rook b2, the pressure is still there. Queen a4 hitting c2 more, and now forcibly exchanging off a pair of rooks this way with rook d3. Rook takes d3, c takes, queen takes, so black is the exchange up, and this has very limited prospects for white. The king improves itself coming in to white's position. The bishop gives up the ghost of that c5 pawn there. Yeah, I mean the king's just going to come in anyway, potentially to f3. So this, let's see the technique a bit. the game actually ended here. As an example continuation, rook h3, and the bishop is overworked here and underpaid, overworked and underpaid, and actually the king comes in, improves until this position where it's a zugzwang, for example. So if the king moves, there's rook d1 checkmate, and the bishop moves now, f4 drops. So that will be the beginning of the end, as an example. So what have we witnessed here? It's a positional masterpiece, absolute positional masterpiece, masterclass. I think Petrosian would be proud of this game. White was given no counterplay at all. Petrosian, as a personality trait, some people have observed that his style might be influenced, that he just didn't like losing. Earlier in his career, he was like attacking and dynamic, much more taking risks. But later, he just didn't like losing at all, and developed a really heavy prophylaxis style with a preference for these kind of closed positions with not much going on. And this is ideal for Leela against classic AB engines to adopt a supercharged Petrosian style of chess. This opening was well suited to creating that climate for a locked-in pawn chain, that dark square bishop a prisoner in its own pawn chain, the mighty knight on d5, how the outside pass pawn was celebrated. Wonderful stuff. If you enjoyed this game, and I hope you did get a lot out of it positionally, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessworld.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also, if you want to, there's new channel memberships, by the way, I should mention. You can also, if you have a channel membership, you get a free full month of Chess World, and I'll invite you for a game as well, so check out channel memberships. You can also check out the YouTube analysis in advance from the improved menu Learn from the Masters YouTube order button. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with notification bell, appreciate it. And also there's a new Teespring store in the description as well. Thanks very much.